If you love Review Mirror Chronicles podcast and want to help us keep bringing you brilliant episodes, then please share it with a friend or a fellow history fan who you think might enjoy it. Thanks for your support, and I do hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, I'm Keith Hockton. Today we dive into one of the greatest mysteries in mountaineering history, one that still grips climbers and adventurers nearly a century later. Did George Mallory and Sandy Irvine conquer Mount Everest in 1924, a full 29 years before Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay made their historic climb in 1953? Did they reach the summit and vanish on the descent, claiming a ghostly place in history as the first to stand on the roof of the world? And what does it actually mean to climb Everest? Hillary famously said that the summit only counts if you make it back down alive, that it's not just about touching the top, but returning to tell the tale. And it's a very compelling philosophy. But then again, it's easy to say that when you've planted your flag and you've actually come home. Personally, I think if you reach the summit, I think you've done it. Whether you make it back or not, well, guess what? The mountain will always remember. This story isn't just about Everest. It's about George Mallory, a name that still echoes in the climbing world. You know, even as a child, I remember hearing whispers of his legend. He wasn't just a mountaineer, he was a pioneer. Mallory wasn't following in anyone's footsteps. He was actually carving them. In an era when climbing was still considered, a strange new pursuit, Mallory was actually inventing his own gear. He was experimenting with his own techniques and braving heights that no one had ever dared climb before. So let's rewind to the 20th century when climbing was raw, dangerous, and uncharted. And let's meet the man who might just have beaten everyone to the top of the world. Don't go anywhere. This story is just about to get more exciting. So one of the things I absolutely love about this era is that climbing was being figured out in real time. Climbing gear, there was no manual. These guys were inventing it as they went along. And there's a wonderful quote from a journalist, I can't remember the guy's name, who actually witnessed the 1924 Everest expedition. He said, "The English climbers looked like they were headed out for a picnic, and they got caught in a blizzard." Isn't that wonderful? And honestly, it's not far off. These climbers were wearing tweed jackets. Yes, heavy tweed jackets. They were wearing very heavy hobnail boots with metal spikes hammered into the soles. And today, I doubt whether any climber would even take these up one of the softest hills of any grade in that particular gear, let alone climb, the highest mountain on earth. And just imagine the weight of it all. Now, George Mallory wasn't just a climber. He was an adventurer from the start. As a boy, he was the kind of kid who was always up a tree or scaling a rooftop, on a dare. And he was brilliant too. By 13, he'd actually earned a mathematics scholarship to Winchester College, one of the top schools in England then and even now. And it was there, during a final year trip to the Alps, that the spark caught fire. From that moment on, climbing to him was everything. Later at Cambridge, Mallory studied history and the classics. He was tall, he was athletic, and he was strikingly good-looking. And he was well-liked by all who came into contact with him. And not surprisingly, his name was Galahad, not just for his appearance, but for his noble and chivalrous nature. Summers were spent scaling peaks in England and Wales, and when that wasn't enough, he headed to Europe to challenge himself on the Alps. At this stage, Mallory was very much an alpine climber. And alpine climbing is the purest style. They don't use oxygen, there's no porters. It's just you and your gear, moving very fast and very light. It's ideal, actually, when you're climbing at altitudes around 15 to 16,000 feet, and you're not that far from civilization. And this was Mallory's world. But Everest was another beast entirely. Mountaineering at that altitude demanded something else. It was expedition style climbing. Porters, camps, long supply lines, and experimental oxygen tanks. In the early 1920s, oxygen was incredibly controversial. Many climbers actually rejected it outright, but they'd never climbed Everest. And Everest was going to change absolutely everything. Outside of climbing, Mallory lived a fascinating life. He was a left-leaning intellectual schoolkeeper, deeply embedded in the avant-garde circles of the day. He actually mingled with people like John Maynard Keynes and Virginia Woolf as part of the Bloomsbury Group, a collection of incredibly progressive thinkers and artists who helped shape the 20th century. In fact, I did a podcast on the Bloomsbury Group if you want more detail about them. But then Everest came calling, and the Bloomsbury Group were probably his closest brush to fame until this time. I think what's extraordinary to remember is that when Mallory first fell in love with mountains in his late teens, the whole sport was very much in its infancy. They were still mapping the Himalayas. It wasn't even confirmed that Everest was the world's tallest mountain until 1852. That's how new all of this was. And Mallory? Oh boy, he was certainly ready to climb into history. Up until 1852, the way people figured out mountain heights was, well, it was mostly guesswork. It was like, well, that one looks tall, and it looks maybe taller than that one. And what about that one over there? That's definitely a tall one. But no one actually measured them, not properly. Enter Raghunath Sikdar, a brilliant Indian surveyor and a mathematician. And he actually did the math. He was the one who actually worked out that Peak 15, Everest was still unnamed at the time, was the tallest mountain in the world. And his calculations were actually later confirmed by Andrew Irvine, the then Surveyor General of India. Bit of a fun fact, Sikdar's numbers showed that Everest was exactly 29,000 feet high. But Irvine, incredibly wary that no one would believe such perfectly round numbers, added 2 feet just to make it look a little bit more, I suppose, scientific. And that's how we got to 29,002 feet, which of course led to the joke at the time that Irvine was the first man to put 2 feet on Mount Everest. They actually identified Everest from a whopping 100 miles away, just by eyeballing it. It was literally them looking at it saying, that one's definitely the tallest. It has to be it. And they were absolutely right. And today we know that the exact height of Everest is 29,028 feet, the highest point on Earth. And of course, they named it after Sir George Everest, Irvine's predecessor. But if you ask the locals, they already had names for it. In Tibet, it was Chomolungma, the mother goddess of the world. And that tells you absolutely everything. It wasn't just a mountain, it was a sacred mountain. I've watched countless documentaries and read literally hundreds of accounts. And the reverence that the Nepalese and the Tibetans have for Everest is incredibly profound. There's a deep spirituality to it. And most of the climbers who actually go there will tell you exactly the same thing. Everest is always referred to as she, and there's this sense while you're there, and I've actually helicoptered around it. There's this sense when you see her, there's a respect for her that's actually hard to put into words. And what the Tibetans and the Nepalese say effectively is that if you treat the mountain with humility, she'll treat you kindly in return. Now, figuring out that Everest was the tallest mountain, well, that's one thing. But climbing it, that's totally a different story. In 1852, it was basically, that's amazing, but what do we actually do with that information? No one could actually get there, let alone climb it. Because let's be honest, just reaching the mountain itself is actually a climbing feat, which is why there's so much emphasis put on reaching base camp. In those early expeditions, because they were still finding things out, it wasn't just climbers that would actually make this trek. You had teams of surveyors, you had geologists, you had interpreters, and of course then you had guides, each trying to make a sense of what is effectively unknown terrain. They'd ask the locals everything. What's the avalanche risk? How often do you see avalanches throughout the year? What's the weather like in different seasons? When's the mountain the calmest? This wasn't just a climb, it was an investigation about the area and the mountain itself because they knew absolutely nothing. And of course, Everest doesn't just sit all by herself. She's tucked deep into the Himalayas. So to get to her, you have to first cross multiple other mountains. It's up and it's down and it's up and it's down. And this continues for weeks, if not months on end. So to climb Everest, you're actually climbing to get to Everest. So once you're up there climbing these other mountains just to get to Everest Base Camp, your body actually starts to revolt. You get headaches, you get nausea, you get dizziness. These are just the mild symptoms. At best, you feel like you've got one of the worst hangovers in the world and you're actually standing in a wind tunnel. At worst, you can suffer from pulmonary or cerebral edema where your lungs or your brain actually start filling with fluid. And that's not just discomfort, that's life-threatening. So here's the science. At 5,000 meters, the oxygen in the air is roughly half of what you have at sea level. Your body actually compensates this by breathing faster, taking more oxygen in. But of course, you're breathing harder. Then your lungs dry out. And, people often develop this persistent hacking cough. And it's not just annoying. It's the sound of your body actually struggling to survive. And you're not even in the death zone yet. But when you get to the death zone, well, that's just above 8,000 meters, just above 26,000 feet. This is where the oxygen is so thin that human life actually can't be sustained for very long. Your body actually begins to shut down slowly and then all at once. Your muscles weaken. Your judgment falters, and even small decisions like clipping in or, choosing the right pathway can become absolutely deadly. Many climbers actually don't make it back down from Everest for these reasons alone. And some of them actually don't make it to the top, and some do, but they always leave something behind in the process. And remember, Everest summit sits at 8,848.86 meters. So that's about, rough calculation, that's about 5.5 miles straight up. It's insanely, inhumanly high. Anyway, let's get back to the early 1920s. This kind of ascent still seems just barely within the reach, barely within the realm of possibility. But the Royal Geographical Society and the Alpine Club, they actually believe it's doable. And they get together to form the Mount Everest Committee. Now, the Alpine Club, which was founded in 1857, was, I suppose it's a gentleman's club for mountaineering. It was very proper, it was very exclusive, and at this point, climbing was actually seen as a pursuit for wealthy white men. Women, working class climbers, foreigners, not a chance. No membership for you. But post-World War I, everything begins to shift. Climbing starts to open up. It becomes more democratic, more inclusive of all the classes, and eventually all nationalities and genders. Still, in 1924, committees actually mattered, and they actually decided who got the invitation. And I suppose with the poles already conquered, Everest was the last great blank on the map. And Britain, still nursing its post-war pride, well, they desperately wanted to be the first one to claim it. So they finally get permission from the Tibetan government to explore the mountain. And remember, at this point, they haven't even seen Everest in person. Not one of these climbers has actually glimpsed Everest. There's no routes, there's no maps. They had no idea if it was even possible to actually climb it. This was essentially a theoretical exercise, a kind of a scouting mission. The goal wasn't to summit. It was to figure out how one might eventually summit. So this is in 1921, and the first actual attempt doesn't actually come around until 1922, 1 year later. Now, keep also in mind, Nepal was completely closed to foreigners at the time. There was no way in and no way out. So any access to Everest had to come from the north through Tibet. And while Tibet was largely closed off, the British had been cultivating a very close relationship with the Dalai Lama, and it eventually paid off. And he eventually granted them permission to explore Everest and the surrounding region, which I suppose at the time would have been a massive kind of diplomatic win. There had, however, been one earlier solo effort. In 1913, an Englishman named Captain John Knoll tried to sneak into Nepal, and he actually made it to within 15 miles of Everest before being caught and promptly thrown out, ejected from the country. But you know what? You actually have to admire the nerve. Now, one thing we have to acknowledge, this story is often told from a British perspective. And of course, there's always another side to it. One that doesn't get nearly enough attention, and that's from the Sherpas, the Sherpa side of the story. And quite honestly, with the big exception of Tenzing Norgay, who reached the summit with Hillary in 1953, and rightly became a household name, most of the Sherpas from these early expeditions remain anonymous even to this day. But they were absolutely crucial, and it's important that we acknowledge them. They're the ones who carried the gear. They're the ones who hauled the oxygen tanks. They set up the camps. They cooked the meals. They made these climbs possible. Interestingly, the British even started grading them. There were the carriers, which they graded a 3. These are the guys who actually shouldered the heaviest of the loads. And then there were the cooks, the tent men, and the all-essential men. These were grade 2s, and then the grade 1s were the elite Sherpas who climbed with the climbers, the one who would actually scale Everest alongside you. And these were actually nicknamed, certainly by the 1924 expedition, the Snow Leopards. And if you were going up that mountain, these were the men that you wanted with you. They were the ones that you absolutely wanted by your side. In 1921, George Mallory was then 34 years old. He was selected for the expedition. And at that point, he was widely considered the best alpine climber in the world. And he had something rare. He had a burning intensity, a kind of a tunnel vision. When Mallory actually set his sights on something, especially something as formidable as Everest, he would not be swayed. And I think it was the fire within him that actually made him so extraordinary. At that time, he was actually working as a teacher at Charterhouse School, a school that we actually used to play rugby against, funnily enough. But he actually resigned his position to take on the challenge. He'd fought in World War I, he survived the trenches, and returned home largely to a society that felt changed, kind of very disconnected. Like so many veterans, he actually found it hard to slot back into ordinary life. And the call of Everest came at exactly that right moment. It gave him purpose, it gave him direction, and I think more importantly, it gave him a chance to escape. The 1921 expedition was officially known as the British Mount Everest Reconnaissance Mission, and it was led by Charles Howard Berry, a British soldier, an amazing explorer, a botanist, and an MP, and another great World War I veteran. And here's something that really struck with me, when I was doing the research. Before Mallory left, he told his wife that he actually planned to leave a photo of her at the summit of Everest. Now remember, this wasn't a summit expedition. This wasn't even part of the brief. But that tells you everything that you need to know about George Mallory. If the mountain gave him an opening, a window, he was going to take it. The 1921 expedition, surprisingly, was a huge success, at least in terms of, what they set out to do. No, they didn't climb Everest, but they did find a way in, and that was no small feat. They actually discovered a route called the North Col. It was a very high, a very windswept ridge that links one mountain to another. And even today, over a century later, if you're approaching Everest from the Tibetan side, this is still the route that you would take. It's steep, it's brutal, and it's far more technically demanding than the more popular Nepalese routes. Of course, hardly anyone climbs that side now. Tibet is actually closed off to foreigners. The Chinese government has effectively sealed it off, and it's a hen's tooth chance of actually being able to climb from that side. But back then, the North Col became the holy grail for British climbers. It was their first real key to climbing Mount Everest. And I think what's important to note is that the North route involves about 22 miles of sheer effort, 22 miles longer than the Nepalese approach, which is already no picnic at roughly, 12 or 13 miles. But no matter which path you take, Everest is going to make you earn every single step. And the thing is, Everest isn't just a climb. It's every kind of climbing packed into one. It's rock climbing, it's ice climbing, it's glacier traversing, it's high altitude hiking. And those glaciers, they're not just some picturesque white sheet. These things are lethal. And of course, we're talking about a constantly shifting battlefield of ice, deep, jagged crevasses, literally hundreds of feet deep that will swallow you whole if you take a misstep, massive avalanches that can erase a team in seconds. Seracs, these towering blocks of ice the size of a house. And of course, you don't just climb over them, you gamble with them because they can collapse at any moment without warning. And this is all before you even get to the real mountain. Just the glacier alone, getting across that glacier alone, that's a feat to behold. Again, which is one of the reasons why base camp is such a tremendous achievement. That glacier alone can kill you. Now imagine facing all of that in 1921. No Gore-Tex, no lightweight crampons or precision gear. Everything they carried was heavy. Everything they wore was wool or canvas. The boots, basically heavy leather tanks. And yet these guys went anyway. Their level of fitness would have been just beyond anything that you could imagine. Honestly, I should do a whole podcast on ice climbing, or maybe even one on all the climbers who never made it back down. There are literally hundreds of bodies still lying on Everest, not as a spectacle, but to actually honor the men who gave it a go. And what they do is they act as a reminder to us of just how much Everest actually demands from those who actually dare. I don't say this lightly, who dare to scale her sides. There are so many ways to die up there. And I think what's interesting as a non-climber, not all of them are understood. It's not just the climbing, it's the cold, it's the falls, it's the altitude. And get this, the early climbers actually believed in the Yeti. Yep, this is actually where the Western Yeti legend took off. From this very expedition. Some of the teams actually returned with stories of huge tracks, huge footprints, up in the mountain ranges, large humanoid type footprints. And of course, mountaineers are just as good as divers. The tales grew, pardon the pun, and the stories just got better and better. And I think what's really interesting is that even in 1951, famed explorer Eric Shipton, he supposedly actually snapped photos of enormous footprints, very near Everest. And of course, that really just kind of fueled the fire. And suddenly, the Yeti wasn't just a Himalayan myth. It was actually front page news. And of course, that's when Hollywood kind of picked up on it. Whether you believe it or not, the idea of something ancient and unknown stalking the slopes of Everest, you can imagine that back in 1921, can't you? It's that kind of mountain. It's deadly terrain. It's part myth. It's part spiritual guardian. So, I get it. Real or imagined, I think it actually makes Everest the most mysterious and dangerous mountain in the world even today. And on that note, folks, let's just take a break and hear a message from our sponsor. Autonomous is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much, much more than that. When you sign up with Autonomous, you become part of a larger community, a community that actually cares about you and your family in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. For more information, go talk to TG or WhatsApp him on +60 12 49 37 270 or visit their website penangmyhome.com. And we're back. Okay, so let's just catch up. It's 1921 Mallory and the team reached the North Pole, and for the first time, they believe they found the route to the top of Everest. But here's the thing. No one's standing on the summit yet. Every attempt after this one ends in failure. They don't make it to the top, but that doesn't mean that those climbs weren't a success. Every failure brought progress. Every step higher, every route explored, every lesson learned. It all laid the groundwork for the future climbers. You kind of figure out what works and what doesn't. You learn how the mountain behaves. And crucially, you actually begin to find the best places to build your base camps. And those camps are everything. You see, if you're climbing Everest and you know there's a higher camp waiting for you, that actually becomes your mental target for the day. You can push up, you can spend the night, you can recover. But if there's no camp ahead, you have to turn back. And you have to make it all the way back to the lower camp before nightfall. Because once it's dark on Everest, that's it. If you're caught in the open after dark on Everest, well, your chances of survival are very, very small. The cold, the wind, the oxygen levels, it's not survivable. Although, incredibly, there was one guy recently, in recent times, who actually did survive a night on the mountain. Climbers actually thought he was dead, just another body lying next to, what was their path. And all day, they just walked right by him. But the next morning, when a team passed through, someone actually saw him move. He'd spent the entire night at a very, very high altitude in a very shallow cave next to an actual dead climber. This guy lived, but he paid the price. He lost all of his fingers. He lost all of his toes. He even lost his nose. Everest actually gives nothing for free. So these early climbers, they weren't just chasing a summit. They were building knowledge. They were discovering just how high the human body could go. What altitude did your mind and muscles fail at? What gear failed at what level? How did you survive? Even basic things like the best time of the year to attempt to climb, none of this was known, and they were discovering it all in real time. Even something as seemingly simple as what time of day to start climbing turned out to be life or death. Start too late, and you won't make it back down before the cold and the darkness catch you. And of course, there's that question of what counts as a successful climb. Hillary said it only counts if you summit and come back down. And as I said, sure, it's easy to say it when you've done both. But Mallory, he actually gave us one of the greatest quotes in climbing history. When someone asked him, "Why do you want to climb Everest?" his answer was, "Because it's there." And that line actually became legendary, and it's now used for a multitude of things. Why are you eating that pizza? Because it's there. Timeless wisdom by George Mallory. And I think the really cool thing is that even when you use that phrase, every time someone casually drops that line because it's there, they're actually quoting George Mallory. Whether it's Everest or a second helping of cake, it all goes back to him. Now, let's talk about something incredibly crucial: oxygen. You absolutely need it on Everest. These days, climbers have sleek, lightweight oxygen canisters. They're easy to carry, they're easy to use. It's basically standard issue. But back then, it was a totally different story. In the 1920s, they were lugging glass bottles of oxygen packed into wooden crates. They were heavy, they were awkward, they were wildly impractical. And yet here's the kicker. Most climbers at the time didn't even like the idea of using it. It was considered cheating. Can you imagine? I have to say, Mallory wasn't a fan either. He thought the whole setup was a nuisance, and he really, really didn't want to rely on it. And he certainly didn't want to drag extra Sherpas and 30 extra pounds of gear just to maybe be able to use it near the summit. And his attitude was very clear. Real climbers don't need bottled air. And that makes what they achieved, I think, even more astonishing. If you've ever seen footage of modern climbers approaching the top of Everest, you know what it looks like. Kind of people moving in incredible slow motion, literally. They take a step and they stop and they wait. And then 15, 20, maybe 30 seconds later, they take another step even when they're using oxygen. So really, what was it like for Mallory and the early climbers without it? Now, they didn't use oxygen in 1921, even on the reconnaissance mission. They didn't use it in the 1922 climb either. Mallory actually reached 26,800 feet on that attempt, a world record for altitude at that time. And he had to turn back, but it was a huge milestone. And remember, every step higher was new territory for humankind. No one had ever been that high outside an aircraft. And these guys were encountering hurricane-force winds, freezing temperatures, and oxygen-starved air for the very first time. Everest, she doesn't play around. Even today, she reminds us just how deadly she can be. In 2015, there was a 7.8 magnitude earthquake that struck Nepal and the surrounding regions. And that shaking actually triggered a massive avalanche off nearby Pomori, which then smashed into base camp. 22 people were killed. It became the deadliest single disaster on Everest, overtaking the 2014 avalanche tragedy just a year before. The truth is, Everest is still wild. She's still unpredictable. Still the most dangerous mountain on Earth. Not just because of what it demands from the climbers, but because what it doesn't care about. And back in Mallory's day, they were facing all of that with next to nothing. They were wearing wool, tweed, heavy leather boots, but what they had was an incredible backpack of courage. Thinking back about it now, there was actually a major avalanche in 1921 too, not 1921 too, but 1921 as well. And miraculously, no one actually died. Of course, then came 1922. These guys were getting closer, and they were getting closer than anyone had ever come. In 1923, the momentum paused, not because of fatigue, but because they ran out of money. Climbing Everest was, and still is actually, extraordinarily expensive, and Mallory and the others took to the lecture circuit, touring around the United Kingdom, giving talks to raise funds for the next attempt, selling the dream, really, to fund that climb. Which brings us nicely to 1924, the most famous expedition of them all. This time, things got a little bit political. George Finch, an Australian chemist, climber, and arguably, I think, one of the fittest and finest alpinists of his generation, was left off the team. He's the very same man who just 2 years earlier had become the first human to climb above 8,000 meters, and they'd left him off. The Times newspaper would later describe Finch as one of the two best alpinists of his time. But in 1924, the British climbing establishment turned its back on him, and Mallory was absolutely furious, and he actually threatened to pull out of the expedition entirely if Finch wasn't brought back in. In the end, Finch wasn't reinstated, but to appease Mallory, they actually brought in someone new, Andrew Sandy Irvine. And Irvine, well, he was special. He was 22 years old, but already an extraordinary athlete. He was tall, he was broad-shouldered, and as Mallory put it, as strong as an ox. But he wasn't just muscle. Irvine had a brilliant mechanical mind. At just 15 years of age, he sent a design to the British War Office for a machine gun that could actually fire through a plane's propeller without hitting the blades. I mean, an innovation that was just being explored by aviation engineers at the time. This kid's 15. He then went on to study at Oxford, where he became a champion rower. He was cool under pressure. He was fiercely intelligent. And of course, he was physically built for endurance. And this was exactly the kind of climber that you wanted on your rope. And of course, now the stage is set. Everest, 1924. The mountain had never been so close. Mallory had a specific reason for wanting Irvine on the team, and it wasn't just the raw strength, it was the oxygen. Irvine was an engineer. By 1924, it was actually painfully clear if you were going to summit Everest, oxygen wasn't optional. The upper atmosphere there simply didn't allow for survival, let alone success without it. And oxygen gear back then was incredibly unreliable. It was finicky and prone to failure. especially under extreme conditions near the summit. And of course, it's highly flammable. During his downtime at camp, Irvine personally modified the oxygen cylinders, tweaking valves, reworking the breathing system, shaving off bits of weight where he could, and trying to make it more efficient. And keep in mind, guys, this was no small task. I mean, oxygen, as I mentioned, is highly flammable. You don't want someone experimenting at altitude with it unless they absolutely know what they're doing. And Irvine did. So yeah, he was young, he was strong, but more than anything, he was vital to the climb because of his technical skills, and Mallory absolutely knew it. Mallory, by contrast, brought something else: experience. He was hands down the finest alpinist of his generation, and he'd been on all 3 Everest expeditions. No one at this stage knew the mountain better than he did. He was the old hand, Irvine was the new blood, and together they made an incredible team. Which brings us to the question, why wasn't George Finch on that team? Why wasn't he there with Mallory? And the hard truth is, it was politics. Finch was an Australian, a colonial, and the British establishment wasn't about to let a man from the empire's periphery, to be the first man to stand atop the world. Never mind that he was arguably the best climber alive, or one of 2 best climbers alive. Never mind that he'd already climbed higher than any other human in history. He was just quietly dropped from the team. All right, let's jump forward to June the 1st, 1924. Mallory and the team established Camp 6, perched at a staggering 25,000 feet, the highest camp ever to be set up on the mountain at that point. And this was going to be their base for the final push. The next day, 2 of the team's strongest climbers, Edward Norton and T. Howard Somerville, made an attempt on the summit, and they got incredibly close. They got painfully close. They were within 1,000 feet from the top. But altitude is cruel. It flattens you, it drains you, and they were so exhausted they had to turn back. And while 1,000 feet sounds close, on Everest, it's still a world away. Still, Norton had set a new world altitude record. No one had ever climbed that high before. But what everyone then knew was that the summit was there and it was within reach. And this is where Mallory makes his move. He could feel that it was close. After Norton and Somerville reached the 28,000 feet level, it really seemed like the summit was just within reach. But when you actually look at a topographical map, the final stretch from 28,000 to 29,000 feet is an entirely new universe. It's a vertical mile of deep snow, ice walls, and incredibly thin air, and it's brutally slow going. Still, it was a record that stood for some years. But the cost? Well, it was immense. Somerville nearly suffocated on the way up. His throat actually clogged. His lungs were gasping. And Norton, in one of the most harrowing mishaps, actually removed his goggles multiple times. And at that altitude, the ultraviolet rays are so intense that they literally burned his corneas. And he actually came back snow-blinded. Everest had extracted its price. Next up were Mallory and Sandy Irvine. By all accounts, they were in incredibly good spirits. They were optimistic, they were energized, and they actually sent notes down with their Sherpas, talking about how perfect the weather was, how well they both felt, how ideal the conditions were for a summit attempt. And it all sounded incredibly promising. Everything we know about what happened next comes from one man, Noel Odell, who was a geologist and a climber, and as far as Everest goes, an unsung hero. This guy actually lived well into his 90s, and he gave a famous interview in the 1980s describing the moment with clarity and reverence. On that day, Odell had climbed up toward one of the higher camps, likely scouting rocks, but also, helping resupply Mallory and Irvine with, water and food. And this was it, the final summit bid. Mallory at this stage was 37 years old, and that was actually considered old for high altitude climbing back then. And he must have also known that this was possibly his last chance. So he and Irvine had actually set out from the highest established camp, which at this stage was at 27,000 feet on the North Col. At 12:50 p.m., Odell was high up. The sun was out, the skies were clear, and for once, there was absolutely no wind. This was perfect Everest weather. And he actually looked up towards the northeast ridge, and he saw them. And this is what he said. The entire summit ridge and the peak of Everest were in view, and my eyes became fixed on one tiny black dot beneath the rock step in the ridge. That black spot moved, and then another black spot came into view and moved up the snow to join the other on its crest. They climbed and disappeared from view, and then shortly emerged at the top. Moments later, however, the clouds had rolled in. That was the last time anyone ever saw George Mallory and Sandy Irvine alive. Odell waited and waited. There was no movement, no figures returning to camp, no signs of life. Hours passed, then the day, and then the reality began to sink in. But instead of retreating, Odell did something absolutely extraordinary. He climbed higher up towards Camp 7, above 26,700 feet on his own to search, to hope. And this would have been incredibly dangerous, and he'd already been high for far too long. And the human body begins to die at that altitude without oxygen. But still, he actually searched for 2 days on his own, and he found nothing. And the thing is, Odell didn't even have oxygen with him during those final days of searching. And that made what he did even braver. He stayed high, hoping, pushing his body to its limits. But in the end, he had to accept the truth. From Camp 7, he sent a message down to the lower camp. He couldn't find them. And in response, Base Camp sent a solemn signal. Give up hope, come down. Before he left, he actually laid out 6 sleeping bags in the shape of a cross. And then he descended. He'd been above 25,000 feet for 11 days. That too had never been done before. And of course, Mallory and Irvine were gone. But they had done something absolutely timeless. They really embodied, the very spirit of human adventure, the unshakable drive to go higher, to go further, to stand where no one had stood before. And these 2 men risked everything for a dream. And I think it's that particular dream that actually keeps their story alive. So the question is, did they make it to the top? The official consensus says no. Odell saw them ascending late in the day, too late perhaps to summit and return safely. But the debate actually rages on because there are clues, tantalizing clues, that keep the door open, just enough to make one wonder. And a big part of that mystery is actually Odell himself. He was actually renowned for his exceptional eyesight. He didn't even need glasses until he was in his 90s. And in his account, he was very clear. He saw them near the second step. That's important. There are 3 major steps leading to Everest summit from the north, and the second step is the most critical, and it's just beneath the final ridge to the peak. And here's where I suppose the ambiguity kind of creeps in. Some argue that Odell must have seen them on the first step, not the second. The visibility, the distance, the timing, they say it doesn't add up. And interestingly, at one point in his life, Odell did say that it was the first step before later correcting himself and insisting, no, it was definitely the second. And if it was the second step, well, that changes everything. Because knowing Mallory, knowing his sheer determination, his strength, if he made it that far, absolutely nothing would have stopped him from reaching the top. Absolutely nothing. And when Odell gave that interview at age 97, still fully compos mentis, still very sharp, still certain, he said this: "There is nothing that would have stopped those 2 from getting there. I believe they did." And look, maybe they did. But at this point, you would also have to say that it was very much a suicide mission. It was very late, way too late in the day to be pushing for the summit. The clouds had started to gather, and these clouds meant only one thing: a blizzard was coming. Even if Mallory and Irvine had reached the top, the odds of them getting back to Camp 6 and surviving the night, well, they would have been almost non-existent. And of course, it all comes down to one agonizing detail. Were they on the first step or the second step? Because if they were on the first step, they didn't make it. But if they had reached the second, just beneath the summit, then I would argue that they almost certainly did. Let's park that idea just for a second and look at what came next. Over the decades, Everest would slowly give up its secrets. Not all of them, but just enough to keep this story, this fire burning. In 1933, an expedition found Irvine's ice axe high up on the mountain, lying in the snow. Now, here's the thing. As a climber, you never leave your ice axe behind. Ever. It's your lifeline. If you fall or you slide, it's the only thing that can stop you. So if it was left behind, something terrible must have happened. Then in 1975, a group of Chinese climbers took the same route that Mallory and Irvine had followed. One of them later reported seeing a body, a frozen Englishman high on the north side. But before anyone could actually follow up that story, that particular climber was actually killed in an avalanche, and the story just went cold. Still, the whispers in the climbing community persisted, the rumors, the possibility that Everest had actually kept its secrets, preserved in ice. In 1991, another small expedition found an old oxygen cylinder, almost certainly belonging to Mallory or to Irvine. And then came the breakthrough. 1999, a National Geographic-sponsored team launched a full expedition specifically to find the two lost climbers. And here's the kicker. They did. At first, they thought it was Sandy Irvine, but as they examined the body, they realized they'd actually found George Mallory. And he was remarkably well preserved. Obviously frozen, but he was sun-bleached. His clothes were still intact, but his body actually told a harrowing story. His leg was shattered, his foot was nearly severed, and there was a deep rope trauma visible around his waist, suggesting he'd taken a very violent fall, maybe when still tied in. And then they turned him over, and that's when they saw it. A perfectly round hole, about an inch wide, in the center of his forehead. I mean, the theory is chilling. Mallory fell, and as he tumbled, his ice axe struck a rock, rebounded, and then drove itself into his skull. A terrible injury. But as grim as it sounds, perhaps a very quick end. And if you're plummeting down the side of Everest, I think a fast death is the only mercy that the mountain might offer. The rope was still tied around his waist, but it had snapped. Crucially, the other end wasn't attached to a second body. It wasn't still linked to Irvine, and it would have been. Which opens up the other possibility. Maybe Mallory had anchored the rope to a rock trying to rescue Irvine, or maybe, just maybe, he'd actually sent Sandy back down and made a final solo push towards the summit. After all, he was the more experienced climber. Maybe in that final moment, he decided to risk only his own life and not Irvine's. A choice which would have been full of courage and self-sacrifice. There's one clue, one deeply personal clue that suggests that Mallory did make it to the top. When his body was found, everything was still with him. His notes, his wallet, his altimeter. But guess what? There was one thing that was missing. The photo of his wife, Ruth. And that matters because, do you remember? Mallory had actually promised her. He told her before he left that if he reached the summit, he would leave her photo there at the very top of the world. A gesture of love, a quiet marker of his triumph. But when they found him, it wasn't on him. And it wasn't in his tent either. And he'd left plenty of gear behind there. There were lots of personal items, even a valuable compass that he clearly intended to pick up on his way back down. So, if that photo wasn't with him and wasn't at camp, then maybe it's still on the summit, right where he said he'd leave it. And I think for me, that's really what tips the scale. It's a clue. It's a small thing. But sometimes, these small things actually speak the loudest. There's another mystery too, the missing camera. These guys carried a Kodak Vest pocket camera on their final climb. Irvine was said to have it with him all the time. And if they made it to the summit, you can guarantee that they would have taken a photograph. That's just how climbing works. You document it, proof, glory, memory. But that camera has never been found either. Now, here's where it gets more intriguing. Remember the 1975 Chinese expedition, the one that supposedly spotted the body of an English climber on the North Face? If that climber was Irvine, then maybe the camera was found too. Maybe someone knows more than they're letting on. And if they did find that camera, if it holds a photograph of Mallory and Irvine standing on the summit in 1924, well, that would rewrite the history of Everest. So why stay silent? Well, consider this. That 1975 Chinese expedition was the first official summit of Everest from the Tibetan side, and it was a huge national triumph. But if a lost roll of film were to show that two British climbers had actually beat them to it over 50 years earlier, well, that changes everything. And of course, it would take away the honor. So maybe silence is safer. Look, it's an endlessly fascinating story, a mystery that keeps calling people back. I personally believe they made it, both of them. I think they knew the risks. I think they knew that they wouldn't make it back. And I think they made a pact, one way only, to summit Everest, to do the impossible, and to leave their names on the roof of the world, even if no one would know it for sure. And maybe that's the beauty of this particular story. George Mallory and Sandy Irvine disappeared into thin air near the top of the world, leaving behind no footprints on the summit, no flag, no photograph, just questions, just possibilities. And I think that's perhaps what makes this story so timeless. Because in a world that's obsessed by proof and precision, the mystery of Mallory and Irvine reminds us that some of the greatest achievements don't need to be certified to be real. They just need to be felt. They need to be imagined. They need to be believed in. Mallory once said that he climbed Everest because it's there. And maybe they reached the summit. Maybe they didn't. But they tried. And in trying, they became more than climbers. They became legends. And in a way, maybe that's even greater than knowing for sure whether they did or not. Thanks for listening in, folks. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please share it with a friend, and I'll speak to you again next week. Bye for now.